I actually can't see anyone, so that's fine, I guess. My name's Amber. I am part of the University of Greenwich, but maybe not for very much longer because I am soon to graduate. Well, actually, do my Viva and then I'll graduate, which is fine. But yeah, so today I'm going to be talking to you about what I call the New Age wet nurse. And what's really fun about tonight is we can talk about our research in ways that we can't necessarily do in kind of academic circles. So just to kind of gauge the room, although I don't know how I'm going to do this because I can't actually see anyone. I just wanted to ask you guys a couple questions, and I wondered if you would oblige me by answering. So the first one is, has anyone here ever heard of or thought of breastfeeding? Yeah, okay, so we have. Cool. Okay. Second question is, has anyone in the room actually breastfed? Cool, okay. And to really kind of tie us all together in a neat little bow, who here has been an infant that has ever been fed? Cool, yeah. So that means that we can all kind of relate to the topic, which is good. So I kind of wanted to start by asking you to think about what does breastfeeding mean to you? What does it symbolize in your head? Is it something that you've kind of heard other people do but not really done yourself? And just keep that kind of in your mind as we go through this topic. One thing that I wanted to do this evening is I wanted to instead rather than talk about what my study is and how it can impact the future, I wanted to talk about what breastfeeding has looked like in the past as a way of informing why people do certain things and why I investigated them. So I wanted to start in ancient Egypt. You might think that's a really long time ago, but it's my talk. So, so in ancient Egypt, the maternal mortality rate was super high. Women were dying more often than not, which was not great. And that meant that there was a lot of babies who needed a mother, but also a source of nutrition. They also tried to give babies like animal milk. So I think the animals that were kind of most common or at hand were camels, and unsurprisingly, this made the babies pass away. So they soon realized, okay, we can't give a baby camel milk because they can't digest it. So enter wet nurses. Wet nursing was very commonplace, and it was considered quite an honourable and worthy profession, especially for those who nursed royal babies. And if you nursed royal babies, it was considered like a godly duty. You were sometimes adorned with headdresses, you had a crown, you had like a special room in, I want to say palace, but I don't know if that's the right word for an Egyptian dwelling. I don't know. But that they would have a separate room, and they would be adorned with all these jewels and gold and all of that. So you can see it was quite a valued and revered profession. However, in ancient Greece and Rome, the attitude towards wet nursing varied. They had the same issue, mothers were dying. However, they saw themselves as more evolved. And so they started to question whether if a maternal bond is between a baby and a mother, is it birth that causes that connection? Is it breast milk? And so they thought that wet nurses being involved in that disrupted that connection. They also had quite like stringent rules on who could be a wet nurse. You needed to be brunette, Greek, and young. So yeah, I mean, that probably was common. I want to now move on to the Middle Ages. So this is in and around the 5th century to, I think, the 15th century. And they hadn't really evolved much past ancient Greece and Rome in their attitudes towards wet nurses and breastfeeding in general. They favoured mothers breastfeeding their own children. However, they did know, because medicine hadn't really developed as much, that mothers would die and babies would need feeding, and so wet nurses were the best option. That's true to a point as well, that wet nurses were commonplace, but if you were a rich or a noble family, you could use wet nurses with no problem. No one batted an eye at you. It was because breastfeeding has a natural contraceptive effect. And if you breastfeed a baby, but you have a daughter, God forbid, in these times, you would then need to have a baby, preferably a boy, to secure the line to the throne. So women needed to be able to reproduce at any time. So that's why wet nurses were quite common for the upper elite. They also had this really weird belief that if you fed a baby animal milk, they would then start to do behaviors of those animals. Say you gave it cow's milk and it started mooing, they'd be like, oh, it's possessed, it's not good. So they kind of steered away from animal milk. Plus, they didn't know how to sterilize anything, so it would have been horrific. So this guy that you see at the bottom of the page, his name is Cotton Mather's, and he was a Puritan minister. And he was a really, really super cool guy because he basically moralized breastfeeding. He made it so women felt really bad if they didn't breastfeed their own children. He said things like it was your duty from God, and if you didn't do it, you were half a mother, and all these really, really nice, encouraging things when you've just birthed an infant. So that caused a lot of stigma, a lot of kind of demeaning attitudes towards women. And it also created this kind of stigma for the poor, because a lot of poorer women couldn't do anything but wet nurse, and elite women needed to produce more children, so they needed them. So it just became this vicious cycle. I also really want to talk about the Renaissance period. It's one of my favorites. I love it because I really like the artwork. So you can see in Renaissance paintings that they feature quite a lot of religious iconography. They had a real thing for the Virgin Mary. They put her on everything, even in scenes where she wasn't. They were like, we'll put her in there, it's fine. So what they did by having all this artwork and these statues around with the Virgin Mary on there was because a lot of the people were illiterate during this time. They couldn't read the Bible. They couldn't read what was then considered like public policy about what a good mother would be. So if you saw the Virgin Mary and she was breastfeeding your kid, you'd think, well, they hoped you'd think, she's good. I have to breastfeed too if I want to be good. So that's what it became. It became this kind of split between Mary, who was so good and sexless and calm and peaceful, and then they would kind of stick even. I don't know if you can tell from the image that's kind of, I don't know my left or my right, but the one that's this way. Eva's at the bottom and she's clasping a fruit. And that was really what they dichotomized women as. You were either a Mary, who was loving and motherly and good, or you were an Eve that caused, in their opinion, the whole world to fall apart. So that was fun. So now kind of going into the early modern period, this is a time in which we find ourselves in the thick of empire and colonization. And so British colonists, they traveled the seas and they settled on the Americas, and they tried to recreate the economy that was in Europe. It didn't really go to plan. Unsurprisingly, if you don't talk to the native people and discuss the land that you're trying to conquer, things can go very wrong. So their crops didn't take root. They brought like devastating illness with them that killed many of them, but also much of the Native American population. And everyone kind of died, which is obviously not great if you're trying to start a new civilization. Also, fun fact, this is not related to breastfeeding, but they have done recent studies on the bones of those who died in the early parts of Jamestown, and they found that things were so dire that they started to eat each other. So it was really going well. But in that, there was this massive resistance from the Native American people because they didn't want to become the laborers of the New World. They didn't want to start working on the land that no longer belonged to them. So like all colonizers do, they look elsewhere for people to exploit, and they settled on Africa, and they stole people from Africa, and they made them work in their lands. But how this relates to breastfeeding is, I mean, you can see in the in the pictures, those are babies feeding babies. And African women lost their autonomy. They were not able to breastfeed their own children anymore. They had to care and nurture for white babies. And their babies were then kind of weaned off at 3 to 5 months. I'm not a mum myself. I've not actually breastfed anyone because I don't have a baby. That would have been weird. Sorry. Brain fart. But I've been told that you shouldn't really wean a baby off of breast milk from the first sort of 12 months. So if you consider it's 3 to 5 months, these babies were robbed of development. And a lot of these babies actually died because they were fed, again, animal milk and contaminated water. On our next stop on the exploitation train, we can talk about formula. So in the 1800s was when the first sort of formula was made. I believe the guy's name is Liebig, Justice von Liebig, something like that. I'm not German, so I'm really sorry if I've butchered that. And he made the first formula. He patented it and made it commercially available. And then following that, we had more people in the 1900s, early 1900s, at making things like SMA. Does anyone familiar with SMA? Yeah. Yep. So he made the first kind of version of that. Alongside this, they started to fortify it with iron and fat and protein and try and make it kind of actually digestible for children and not to kill them. Who here, by a show of hands, that I maybe might be able to see, has heard of the Nestle scandal? Cool, okay. So for those who don't know, the Nestle scandal was basically, you know the company Nestle that does like coffee and chocolate and cereal, I think? They had created their own version of infant formula, and they thought, where else should we put this than developing nations that don't have the money to access it, or the things that they need in order to make bottles safely. That is such a good target audience. So they often gave it to countries in the global south that were wildly underprepared for it. And they did it in a way that was so gross that they would dress salespeople up, like marketing people, in nurses' uniforms, and they would plant them in hospitals in these countries, and they would go and talk to pregnant and postpartum women and say, hey, do you want a free sample of this formula? It'll be really good for you and your baby. It will help you sleep, blah, 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 blah. And Nestle were really horrific in the sense that they did research into how long their free sample should last for women's breast milk to dry up. So they rendered them completely helpless and reliant on formula. They also made it extremely expensive. They didn't change the language to fit the country in which they were selling it in. So the families that had this often couldn't afford this formula that their baby was now reliant on, and they also didn't have the information to make it up properly. So powder ratios were wrong, they were using unsterilized water in bottles, and upwards of 10 million babies have died since Nestle started this whole nonsense. So it was then boycotted in the early 80s, and people stopped using formula completely. They took a moralized stance on it and said that it was wrong and that no one should have a part in it. So that then prompted breastfeeding advocacy groups and the World Health Organization to push through things like the Baby Friendly Initiative, to work with hospitals and to kind of champion increased rates of breastfeeding. Who here has heard of Breast is Best? Yeah, okay. I think it'd be pretty hard pressed to find someone that doesn't know that phrase, unless they've been living under a rock. So Breast is Best started as a campaign, again, to increase breastfeeding rates. It started as this kind of socio-political movement. They tried to offer increased maternity rights, free samples for things that actually could be helpful rather than things that would kill your child. They kind of touted all the benefits that breastfeeding has. So they spoke to the immunological benefits that babies would have from breast milk, that women would have less likelihood of developing cervical or breast cancer or osteoporosis. So it started as a very good thing. And I really want to be honest, the benefits of breastfeeding, they're not like, it's not wrong that they spoke of these things, because they are very real, and it's important that that information is shared. However, it then started to be this vehicle of invalidation. It started to say to people, oh, I know that you're struggling, but breast is best. I know that you're in pain, but breast is best. And it just completely reduced women's experiences down to a really smug quip that doesn't really help anyone. So when we think about breastfeeding now, women have, their roles have shifted in society. We're now in the workforce. We have access to maternity leave. We have maternity pay, which means that women's bodies for their children are way more accessible. However, we are still struggling with the sexualization of women's bodies. It can be overt, so in advertising or in or in pornography, and it can also be in more insidious ways, like the regulation of women's bodies and telling women what they can and can't do. So there's a massive issue with how women exist in society and how people feel they can put their agendas on them. I mean, just look at the US. So I kind of want to round up my talk with a question. If you couldn't breastfeed your baby, what would you do? If you had insufficient glandular tissue, which meant that you actually couldn't produce enough breast milk, if you had a mastectomy and didn't have breasts to feed with, if you were a sufferer of abuse and breastfeeding was psychologically not something you could put yourself through, if you were so kind of consumed by this thought that formula was the devil and if you gave it to your child you were a bad mum, what would you do instead? I can tell you what some people do. Some people find breast milk online. So if you can't give them the best, one of my participants said, if you can't give the best, you give second best. And that is apparently milk from someone that you find online. So I researched a group called Human Milk for Human Babies, and I also studied a site called onlythebreast.com. It's punny, only the breast. And so I analysed the posts that were advertising either for milk that they needed it or milk that they had available for someone else. And I looked at the topics and themes that they were discussing in these posts. I also interviewed 9 of the Human Milk for Human Baby community members and 3 professionals. I think 2 were midwives and 1 was a milk bank operative. And so I had a lot of information, which was great. I combined all of this to understand why people engage with this community. Why is something that seems so taboo and not sought out? Why is this now becoming quite an emerging trend? So people's motivations varied. For some people, they had a difficult birth, so their milk didn't come in, or their baby had to be put on an NG tube, which is one of those tubes that goes down your nose, so they weren't able to breastfeed. Some people had just a lack of supply. Some people had an oversupply, and they just needed to get out any and all milk that they could. People were putting it in baths, in their husband's coffee. One person said that they did that. They were just kind of slipping it in. Other people were saying that if they had an oversupply, they wanted to donate it through legitimate means, so to milk banks or to hospitals. But because they are catering to the most vulnerable in society, they had a lot of rules. So you couldn't donate past a certain point, you couldn't donate before a certain point. You had to make sure that the milk was in certain bottles and not packets, or packets instead of bottles. It differed depending on where you were doing it. But there was just a lot of rules. And when you have a newborn, and some people had multiple children, they said that they just couldn't cope with it. The mental load of donating was too much. But it wasn't too much to say, hi, I've got 5 litres of milk in my freezer. Does anyone want it? And people would lap it up. Other people really enjoyed the preference of milk that they could get. So some people preferred unvaccinated milk, or milk from a vegan or dairy-free milk if their baby had a cow's milk allergy. So there was a lot of like tailoring that people felt they could do. Whereas with formula, it's just in a tin and they felt that they didn't really have much say in what went into it. There was also people who just wanted to completely avoid formula, and they felt such immense guilt at having to do it and do that to their child. And this also kind of links to women wanted to be seen as doing the best. They not only to be seen, but they wanted to feel they were doing the right thing for their child. And this is where breast is best links in, because if you are told constantly that breast is best and you can't give the best, does that mean that you're the worst? So a lot of these women had such psychological kind of trauma and angst about what they were giving their child. So why does this matter? Well, formula is safe, it's conventional, it's easily accessible, and you can get specialized ones from doctors or pharmacies to make sure that it's okay for your child. Some people don't get on with it, and that's fine. But it is a conventional and safe way to do it, and we need to destigmatize people using formula because it is a legitimate way of feeding children. It's also important because breastfeeding has become this all or nothing kind of mentality. People are going to extreme lengths to find unregulated, unscreened milk online that could potentially hold threats to their child. And yet, because of the stigma of formula, because women are made to feel like if they're not doing their best, then they're the worst, it puts a real pressure on people to go online. And I'm not saying that online milk is the devil. When I first started this topic, I really thought like, oh, this is weird. I don't know. Like, it's interesting, but I don't know if I could do it myself. And while I still don't know if I could do it myself, I have such empathy and understanding now of the community that it's not weird. It's just another way of doing something. So it's important because sharing milk can be problematic. And if we can unproblematize it, that's not a word, but I've made it, we can help women not feel bad about things. We can make mental health and physical health much better for women and their families. That is my talk. Thank you so much for sitting through it and listening to me.